My neighbor had invited my wife to a party, and I didn't know anything about it. A simple gathering of friends, she told me, with a casual smile that I believed was sincere. She was busy with work, she claimed. I had no reason to doubt it, until that fateful night. When I got home, her absence was deafening. The clock ticked, and every minute without news made despair rise within me like an uncontrollable tide. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Time seemed to drag by as I waited, trying to banish dark thoughts. But finally, I couldn't wait any longer. I made a decision. I needed to know where she was. The party was the excuse, but what really gnawed at me was the feeling that there was something much darker behind it all. And I was right. I drove to the neighbor's house, a man I considered friendly, harmless. The muffled sound of music escaped through the cracks in the windows, but there was no sign that anything was out of the ordinary. Still, my heart hammered in my chest, and distrust pushed me forward. When I entered, the laughter and relaxed conversations seemed like an affront to my torment. But soon, everything fell apart. I saw them together, and in that instant, the world around me fell apart. His arm around her waist, the complicit whispers, the sparkle in the eyes she reserved for him. She was completely surrendered to that moment, to that betrayal. When his eyes finally met mine, I saw panic set in his expression. She knew. I knew everything was lost. And me? I was trapped in a reality I never imagined living. The pain of betrayal ripped through my soul, a pain that only those who have loved deeply can understand. But what consumed me was not just the act itself. That was why. Why did she do this? How did we get to this point? I needed to know. I needed to understand what led her to betray the man who had always been by her side. And it was at that moment, with my heart in tatters and my mind racing, that I realized, this night was just the beginning. What would unfold from there would be a painful and inevitable discovery, a journey into the darkest corner of the heart of the person I once thought I knew. Now, with despair squeezing my chest, the only question that remained was, how far would the truth about this betrayal go? Boston, a city of contrasts, where the past and present meet at every corner. It was an autumn afternoon, and orange leaves were slowly falling from the trees, covering the streets in a blanket of vibrant colors. The homes on Beacon Hill, with their brick facades and tall windows, gave the neighborhood a traditional charm. Among these houses, there was one that, in everyone's eyes, represented the American dream, a peaceful, stable life built on hard work and commitment. But, as often happens, appearances can be deceiving. John, a budding software engineer, lived in that house with his wife, Emily. In the eyes of others, they were the perfect couple, young, successful, in love. John, with his green eyes and neatly trimmed brown hair, was the kind of man who radiated confidence without being arrogant. He was always the kind of person others admired, methodical, responsible, someone you could trust. He was proud of the life he had built, of the long days of work that had resulted in the house on Beacon Hill, the new car in the garage, and, most of all, his marriage to Emily. Emily, in turn, was the woman everyone wanted to be. With her blonde hair that fell in soft waves over her shoulders and her blue eyes that sparkled with intensity, she was a striking presence. He had an aura of serenity, a calm that contrasted with John's constant energy. She spent her days as a freelance graphic designer, working from home, which gave her a freedom that many envied. Yet beneath that calm, contented appearance was a restlessness that no one, not even John, seemed to notice. In the beginning, their wedding was what they both always dreamed of. Trips together, movie nights, conversations about the future. But, as the years went by, the routine began to set in, and something in their relationship began to change. John, immersed in his career, began to dedicate more and more hours to work, believing that he was guaranteeing a better future for both of them. He believed that professional success was the key to happiness, and that each promotion, each raise, would bring more stability and, therefore, more happiness. Emily, however, began to feel like life was slipping through her fingers. She felt trapped in a cycle of days that all seemed the same, without emotions, without the shine that once existed. The nights when John would arrive late, exhausted, only to collapse into bed without a word, became more and more frequent. She tried to talk, tried to make him notice what was happening, but each attempt was thwarted by the invisible barrier that seemed to have risen between them. And it was in this scenario of silent discontent that the neighbor, Daniel, appeared. Daniel had moved in next door a few months earlier. He was a charming man, with an easy smile and a relaxed manner that contrasted sharply with the methodical and almost austere environment that John maintained. He worked as a photographer, and his free and creative lifestyle was something Emily had always secretly envied. Daniel quickly became a constant presence in Emily's life. He invited her to coffee, showed her photos of his travels around the world, and they talked about art, music, and everything Emily missed in her own life. At first, it was just a harmless friendship. John, when he found out about Daniel, showed no concern. He trusted Emily, and the idea that something could happen between his wife and the neighbor never crossed his mind. Over time, however, the casual conversations between Emily and Daniel began to change. What was once just an exchange of ideas about photography and design, now turned into deep conversations about life, dreams, and, inevitably, the frustrations Emily felt in her marriage. Daniel listened to her with an attention that John no longer gave. He made her feel alive again, reminded her of the dreams she had before the wedding, of the plans that were left aside. And then, one night, after one of these long conversations, Daniel did something unexpected. He invited her to a party. Nothing too big, just some friends, a chance to relax, he said, with that smile that made her feel safe and wanted. Emily hesitated for a moment, but the temptation to escape the monotony of her everyday life was too strong. She accepted. John, as usual, was working late that night. Emily prepared for the party with a mixture of excitement and guilt. She knew it wasn't right to hide this from John, but at the same time, she felt that she deserved some fun, a chance to be herself, outside of the role of perfect wife that suffocated her so much. The party at Daniel's house was everything Emily had hoped for. The music, the soft lights, the interesting people who, like Daniel, lived carefree and creative lives. For the first time in a long time, she felt part of something bigger, felt that her life could still have color, movement. But at the same time, there was a feeling of guilt that she couldn't ignore. When Daniel approached her, with a drink in his hand and a look that made it clear that he wanted her, Emily felt her heart accelerate. It was at that moment, as she tried to understand her own feelings, that the door to the room opened, and John entered. Daniel's smile disappeared, and Emily's face paled. She had never seen him like this, with his eyes filled with contained fury. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the music that continued to play in the background, like a distorted soundtrack to a nightmare coming true. Emily knew that at that moment, there was no going back. What had begun as an innocent attempt to escape her reality was now the beginning of a storm that threatened to destroy everything she knew. And as John's eyes burned with unanswered questions, Emily could only think of one thing: how had she let things get to this point? The tension in the air was almost palpable. John left Daniel's house without saying a word, and Emily hesitantly followed him in silence. The way home, although short, seemed to go on indefinitely. Each step echoed like a dull thump, and the streets of Boston, now deserted at this time of night, seemed silent witnesses of what was to come. When they finally entered the house, the warm and familiar atmosphere from before seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a coldness that reflected the state of their hearts. John remained standing in the living room, not looking directly at Emily. His clenched fists and tense jaw revealed the effort he was making to control himself. He was always a rational man, who preferred to resolve things calmly and logically, but at that moment, his world was in ruins. The images of Emily and Daniel together at the party replayed in his mind, like a personal horror movie that he couldn't stop watching. Emily, on the other hand, felt trapped. She didn't know how to begin to explain what was happening. John's gaze, which had once been full of love and trust, now pierced her with a mixture of pain and distrust. She tried to speak, but the words died in her throat. How could she justify what she did? How to explain the emptiness that led her to seek comfort in the arms of another man? But before she could articulate her thoughts, John finally broke the silence. "Why, Emily?" he asked, his voice hoarse and full of emotion. "Why did you go to him?" His question was simple, but it carried a weight that Emily didn't know if she could bear. She felt tears fill her eyes, but she held herself back, knowing that tears wouldn't solve anything at that moment. "John, she began, but didn't know how to continue. The right words seemed impossible to find. John, for his part, was not willing to wait. He needed answers, he needed to understand what had happened, but most of all, he needed to know if there was any way back for them. "You cheated on me, Emily. Is that it?" His voice was now a whisper, as if he didn't want to believe the possibility his words brought to light. Emily shook her head, instinctively denying it. "I didn't. It's not that. It wasn't like that," she tried, but she knew her answer was insufficient. John narrowed his eyes, his thoughts spinning in a whirlwind. "So what was it? Why were you there with him? Why did you go to a party and hide it from me? Tell me the truth, Emily." She knew he deserved the truth, but how could she explain something she herself barely understood? Over the past few months, her friendship with Daniel had filled a void she didn't know existed. And now, that comfort had turned into something darker, something that threatened to destroy their marriage. Emily took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to face the situation. "I felt alone, John," she finally admitted, her voice shaking. "You were always busy, always working. And I needed someone to talk to, someone to make me feel alive again." The words came out more easily now, each carrying a piece of truth. "I didn't want things to come to this. I never wanted to hurt you. But the truth is, I lost myself, John. I lost myself in something I shouldn't have started." John stared at her for a long moment, his conflicting emotions reflected in his eyes. Part of him wanted to believe Emily, wanted to believe that this was all a mistake, something that could be fixed. But another part, a darker and more painful part, feared that what was between them was irreparably destroyed. He turned away from her, unable to bear the closeness, and headed to the kitchen, where he opened a bottle of whiskey. The amber liquid seemed to offer a false sense of comfort, something to numb the pain that consumed him. Emily stood there, feeling helpless. She knew that any attempt to get closer to John at that moment would be in vain. He needed space, and she needed to find a way to deal with the guilt that was suffocating her. But the silence between them was unbearable, a constant reminder of the chasm that had opened up in their relationship. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was cold and tense. John left for work early, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. She spent the day in a daze, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The weight of the betrayal, not just the betrayal of John, but the betrayal of herself, of everything she believed herself to be, was beginning to sink her. In the evening, when John returned home, the silence between them continued. They sat at the dinner table, eating in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected between them, and neither of them knew how to break it down. John still couldn't look at Emily the same way, and she, in turn, was stuck in a cycle of guilt and regret. But that night brought a new twist. As he tried to sleep, John heard his phone vibrate on the nightstand. It was a message from Daniel. With shaking hands, he opened the text and read the words that froze him with terror: "We need to talk. There are things you need to know." What did Daniel know? What did he want to reveal? And why now? John felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that regardless of what Daniel had to say, the truth would be even more painful than he could imagine. And at that moment, it became clear to John that his life would never be the same. Daniel's message brought immediate tension to John, a feeling that gnawed at his stomach like acid. The idea that Daniel had something to say, something he needed to know, only made the situation worse. That night, John could barely sleep, his mind caught in a cycle of dark speculation. Every second seemed to prolong the agony of uncertainty. And as he looked at Emily sleeping beside him, her calm, serene face seemed to be an affront to the storm raging inside him. The next morning, he decided to find Daniel. The mere thought of facing him face to face was almost unbearable, but John knew he needed to resolve this once and for all. The hours until the meeting dragged by as if time were conspiring against him. Emily noticed John's uneasiness, but didn't have the courage to ask what was going on. The silence between them had become the new normal, a wall that they both didn't know how to break down. In the early afternoon, John finally left the house. He drove to an inconspicuous cafe in the South End where Daniel had suggested they meet. The place, normally a welcoming haven for light conversation, now seemed filled with an almost palpable tension. John arrived first, sitting at a table in the corner where he could watch the front door. The coffee, with its comforting aroma of freshly ground beans, couldn't calm the turmoil in his mind. Each customer that entered made her heart skip a beat, until finally Daniel appeared. Daniel entered the cafe with an expression that wavered between anxiety and determination. His eyes met John's, and they both greeted each other with a restrained wave. The easy smile that Daniel always wore was gone, replaced by a seriousness that John had never seen before. They sat in silence, the tension between them almost suffocating. Daniel ordered a coffee, but neither he nor John were really interested in drinks at the moment. There was something much more important at stake. "Thank you for coming," Daniel began, his voice low and cautious. "I know this is difficult, but it's something we need to resolve." John remained silent, his eyes fixed on Daniel's, waiting for him to continue. Daniel took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what he was about to say. "I don't know where to start, but I need to be honest with you, John. Me and Emily, we've gotten closer than we should. And I'm not just talking about friendship." The words hit John like a punch to the gut, but he stood his ground, refusing to show any weakness. He had already suspected as much, but hearing Daniel confirm it was like ripping open a wound he had been desperately trying to keep closed. "How did this happen?" John finally asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Daniel looked away, looking embarrassed. "At first, it was just a connection. Conversations. Emily told me how she felt, about how you two were growing apart. I knew I shouldn't get involved, but something drew us together, and things turned out of control." Daniel paused, trying to measure his words, but nothing could soften the impact of what he was saying. "I made her believe I could offer something different. An escape. And for a while, I thought I could." John felt anger burning in his gut, but he held it in, focusing on the only thing that really mattered at that moment. "Why did you send me that message? What do you think I need to know now?" The question came out harsher than he intended, but it was impossible to hide his frustration. Daniel hesitated before answering, his eyes searching John's, as if trying to find the best way to reveal what came next. "Because, there's something else, something that Emily may never tell you, and that I think you deserve to know. I manipulated her, John. I made her believe she was breaking out of prison, when, in fact, I was building another one." John frowned, confused. "What do you mean by that?" Daniel sighed, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I knew she was vulnerable. I knew she felt alone, and I used that. I made her believe that life with you was suffocating, that she needed to escape. But the truth, John, is that I was projecting my feelings onto her own failures. I was unhappy too, but instead of dealing with that, I decided that Emily would be the solution to my problems." John felt a lump forming in his throat. "You manipulated her. You used her feelings for what, Daniel? To fill a void in yours?" The disbelief in his voice was evident. Daniel nodded, eyes full of guilt. Yes. I convinced her that running away with me was the answer, but the truth is that I had no intention of giving her what I promised. I was using her to fill my own emptiness. And now I see I did, and that's why I'm here, telling you this. Because she doesn't deserve to carry this guilt alone, and you don't deserve to stay in the dark. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with emotions that neither of them knew how to process. John stood up abruptly, unable to continue sitting there. He needed air, needed to get out of that suffocating environment. Daniel also stood up, but kept his distance, knowing that any false move could trigger a violent reaction. John left the cafe, and Daniel followed closely behind. Outside, the cool air hit his face, but it didn't bring the relief he expected. He turned to Daniel, his expression a mixture of pain and anger. You destroyed my life, Daniel. And the worst part of all is that you did it while pretending to be my friend. Daniel hung his head, shame clear in his posture. I know, John. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know the truth, because you deserve to know. John took a deep breath, trying to control the emotions that were bubbling inside him. He didn't know what to do with the information he had just received. Part of him wanted to confront Emily immediately, demand answers. But another part, more rational, knew that I needed to think, I needed to process everything before making any decision. I need time, John finally said, turning to walk away. I need to think. Daniel nodded, respecting John's space. I understand. If you need any more answers, I'll be here. Without looking back, John walked towards his car. He needed a moment alone, a moment to understand what came next. What would he do with the information he had just received? How would this change your life? These questions weighed on his mind, but he knew that, sooner or later, he would have to face Emily again. John drove aimlessly, the streets of Boston passing him by in a blur of light and shadow. He was lost, not just in direction, but in his own life. The pain of betrayal was one thing, but knowing that Daniel had manipulated Emily, that he had taken advantage of her vulnerability, was something else entirely. Anger and sadness mixed together in a whirlwind of emotions that threatened to swallow him completely. When John finally stopped the car, he realized he was in Boston Harbor. The dark waters of the Atlantic reflected the city lights, creating a distorted image that perfectly matched the chaos in his mind. He got out of the car and approached the edge of the pier, looking at the vastness of the ocean, as if searching for answers in the immensity of the waters. As he lay there, alone with his thoughts, John realized that no matter what he decided, his life would never be the same. He had been betrayed, manipulated, but he also knew that he had contributed to the distance that had formed between him and Emily. What would he do next? That was the question that tormented him. And as the cold Atlantic wind bit his face, he knew that the moment to face the truth was getting closer. After hours of solitary reflection on the dock, John decided to return home. He knew that the conversation with Emily could not be delayed any longer. The road back seemed longer than usual, each kilometer a reminder of the weight of the decision he would have to make. When he got home, it was late and the lights were off. Emily was in bed, but John didn't know if she was really sleeping or just pretending. He entered the room silently, sitting on the edge of the bed, his mind still in chaos. He spent the night awake, the rhythmic sound of Emily's breathing beside him, but his body seemed distant, as if he were in another world. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the curtains, he made his decision. I needed answers. He needed to know if there was any future for them, or if the gulf between them was now unbridgeable. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling the weight of last night on her shoulders. She noticed immediately that John had slept poorly, the dark circles under his eyes were evident. John, are you okay? She asked, her voice hesitant. He didn't respond immediately, he just got up and went to the window, looking at the horizon as if he was looking for strength for what was to come. We need to talk, he said finally, without turning to her. Emily felt her heart speed up. She knew this moment would come, but she wasn't prepared for it. Yes, we do, she agreed, sitting up in bed, trying to appear calmer than she actually was. John turned to face her, and she saw the pain in his eyes. I met with Daniel yesterday, he began, and Emily felt like the ground was opening up beneath her feet. She expected everything but that. He told me. He told me what happened. Not just what happened at the party, but everything. He told me how he manipulated you, how he made you believe that running away was the solution. Emily was speechless. The revelation took her by surprise, and for a moment, she didn't know how to react. John, she began, but the words trailed off. She knew she was trapped, that the truth had finally come out, and there was no way to escape. I want to know the truth, Emily. The whole truth. Did you really want to run away? Did you really believe he was the answer to your problems, or did he manipulate you to the point where you couldn't see it? John's voice was calm, but filled with a deep sadness. He didn't want to believe that the woman he loved had been completely taken by another man, but the doubt consumed him. Emily took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. At first, I didn't know what was going on, she admitted, looking directly at John. Daniel, he was easy to talk to. He listened to me, understood me in a way I didn't think you did anymore. I felt alive next to him, John. But I never really wanted to run away. I just wanted to feel something different, something I hadn't felt in a long time. John approached her, sitting on the bed but keeping a distance between them. And when he suggested you run away together? Did you consider it? Emily lowered her head, feeling tears form in her eyes. I considered it, for a moment. But not because I didn't love you anymore, John. I considered it because I was desperate, because I felt trapped in a life that I didn't know how to fix. But deep down, I knew better. I would be happy with him. I knew I was making a mistake. The tears were now falling freely down Emily's face, and John felt a pang of compassion. He wanted to believe her, he wanted to believe that this was all just a detour, a phase that they could overcome together. But the pain of betrayal was still fresh, and he didn't know if he could forgive so easily. And now, he asked, his voice hoarse. Do you still have feelings for him? Emily shook her head vigorously. No, John. I see now what he did. I see how he used me, how he manipulated my feelings. And I hate myself for falling for it, for allowing it to get this far. But what I hate most is that's what it did to both of us. John was silent, processing Emily's words. He knew that the decision he would make at that moment would define their future. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the pain she felt at having caused so much damage. But he also knew that regardless of how Emily felt now, the damage had already been done. Finally, he spoke. Emily, I need time. I don't know if I can forgive you now, I don't know if I ever will. But I know that I love you, and that, despite everything, I still want to try. It's just that it will take time. And I need you to understand this. Emily nodded, tears still streaming down her cheeks. I understand, John. I'll be here, waiting, if you decide there's still a future for us. And I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. John stood up, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. I'm going to need space, Emily. And maybe, that means I need to go away for a while, to think. But I promise I'll be back. And when I do, I hope we can find a way to move forward, whether it's together or no. Emily nodded again, understanding John's need. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was willing to do whatever was necessary to try to salvage what was left of her marriage. John left the house shortly afterwards, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. She knew he needed space, but that didn't make the temporary separation any less painful. She sat on the edge of the bed, the room silent around her, and wondered how it had all gotten to this point. As the sound of John's footsteps receded, Emily realized that no matter what happened next, nothing would be the same again. Trust had been broken, and rebuilding it would be a long and painful process. But despite everything, there was a small spark of hope in his heart. She knew that if they could get through this, maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild themselves, stronger than before. But that was a question for another day. For now, all that was left was to wait. And as Emily looked at the door John had just walked out of, she knew the waiting would be the hardest part of all. The days that followed were painful silence. John had temporarily moved to a hotel in downtown Boston, leaving Emily alone in the house that once symbolized the love they shared. Every corner of the residence was filled with memories, the laughter, the discussions, the plans for the future. Now those memories weighed on Emily like a condemnation, constantly reminding her of what she had destroyed. Emily spent these days immersed in deep reflection, questioning every decision that led her to the point she found herself in. The emptiness he felt inside was immense, a mixture of guilt, regret and fear. She knew she had failed John, but she also knew that that feeling of entrapment that led her to Daniel wasn't something she could just ignore. She was torn between her desire to win John back and the need to understand her own motivations, something that became increasingly complex the more she thought about it. Meanwhile, John, at the hotel, tried to find clarity amid the emotional chaos. He walked the streets of Boston, trying to understand how his life had become unrecognizable in such a short time. The moral dilemma he faced was suffocating. He loved Emily, but he couldn't just ignore the fact that she had considered abandoning him. At the same time, he knew he had contributed to the distance between them by immersing himself so deeply in his work that he failed to notice his wife's emotional needs. John found himself in a dilemma that seemed to have no solution. Should he forgive Emily, trying to rebuild what was broken, knowing that the specter of betrayal would always be there? Or should he move forward alone, allowing them both the chance to start their lives over independently? Each choice seemed to cost too much to bear. The pain of betrayal and the weight of guilt were feelings they both carried, but there was something deeper at play. Emily began to question whether their marriage had ever been truly happy, or whether they were both just fulfilling roles expected by society and themselves. The lack of communication, the stifling routine, the never-discussed expectations, all of this had contributed to the rift. But most of all, Emily began to wonder if it was possible to rebuild something that had perhaps never been solid. On one of those lonely days, Emily decided to write a letter to John, an attempt to express everything she couldn't say in words. She wanted him to know that no matter what happened, she was willing to change, to rebuild herself as a person, and that she hoped he would find peace too, with or without her. The letter was an honest confession, without excuses, but also without expectations. She knew that, in the end, the decision was in John's hands. As she wrote, Emily found herself confronted with a difficult truth. Perhaps the greatest act of love she could offer John was to let him go. Maybe by acknowledging that they both needed time and space to heal and grow, she was truly showing him that she loved him. It was a painful thought, but the idea of trapping John in a relationship tainted by mistrust seemed even more cruel. John, in turn, was also in a dilemma. He knew he could go back to Emily, try to rebuild what was broken, but the doubt would always be there, like a shadow hanging over them. But the thought of moving on without her, of losing the woman he loved despite everything, was just as devastating. John realized that any choice he made would have profound consequences, not just for him and Emily, but for how they would both view life and love going forward. Finally, John received Emily's letter. He read it in silence, feeling the weight of each word, each line written with the pain of someone trying to find meaning in the midst of chaos. The letter didn't offer answers, but rather a mirror so he could see the reality of their relationship in a new light. It was a gesture of honesty, something he knew he needed to recognize and respect. The moral dilemma was now clear to John: forgive and try to rebuild, knowing that nothing would be the same as before, or move forward alone, risking the loneliness and pain of definitive separation. What was more important, the love he still felt for Emily or the need to preserve his own emotional integrity. As John pondered his decision, he knew he could no longer delay the inevitable. He needed to talk to Emily, he needed to confront the reality of their relationship and decide, once and for all, which path to take. This conversation would be the most difficult of their lives, but also the most necessary. And as John drove home, he knew that the moment of truth was getting closer, and that their future, for better or worse, would be decided that night. When John arrived home that night, the weight of the decision he needed to make was clear in his mind. The house was quiet, immersed in a darkness that reflected their emotional state. He found Emily in the living room, sitting on the sofa, with the letter she had written still in her hands, as if she was desperately waiting for an answer, for a redemption that might never come. They looked at each other for a long moment, a silence filled with everything that had been said and, especially, with what had been left aside over the years. John knew the words he was about to say would define their future, and the tension of this moment was palpable. "I read your letter," John began, his voice calmer than he thought possible. "And, Emily, I believe in you. I believe that you never wanted to hurt me, that you lost yourself in something you didn't understand yourself. But..." He paused, trying to collect his thoughts. "I got lost too, and that brought us here." Emily felt her heart tighten, the uncertainty of what would come next was overwhelming. She knew John was struggling with himself, trying to decide if there was room for forgiveness, for reconciliation, or if all was lost. "John, I'm willing to fight for us. I'm willing to face anything, even if it takes time, even if it's difficult. I just don't want to lose you." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words but also knowing there was no easy solution. "Emily, what happened between us left scars. Scars that may never go away. And I know I'm to blame for this too. But the truth is, after all, I don't know if I can move on with this weight between us." John's words hit Emily like a blow, but she knew he meant it. She saw in his eyes the pain of someone she loved deeply but who was now on the brink of an emotional abyss. "So what are we going to do?" The question came out almost as a whisper, Emily's voice shaking with emotion. John approached her, sitting next to her on the sofa, but maintaining a distance that seemed insurmountable. "I think we need time apart, Emily. We need time to heal, to understand who we are now, after everything that's happened. Maybe, in the future, we can meet again, in a different place, in a different situation. Different. But right now, I think the best thing for us is to go our separate ways." Emily felt tears run down her face, but this time, there was no despair, just painful acceptance. She knew John was right. They had reached a point where the love they felt for each other was no longer enough to erase the wounds opened by betrayal, manipulation, and the pain they both caused each other. "I understand," she said, her voice low and broken. "And if that's your decision, I will respect it. But please know that no matter what happens, I will always love you." John looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "And me too, Emily. Me too." He stood up, feeling the final weight of that decision fall on his shoulders. It was as if a part of his life was ending right there, at that moment. But he knew it was the right thing to do, that both he and Emily needed time to rebuild their lives, their identities, without the weight of the past. John picked up his suitcase, already packed, and walked towards the door. Before leaving, he turned to take one last look at Emily. She was still, her eyes full of tears, but there were no more words between them. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. And with one last breath, John walked out the door, leaving behind the house that once symbolized the love and dreams that were now lost to time. Emily stood in the room, alone with her thoughts. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that somehow she needed to find a new way of living, a new way of being. The life he knew had ended, but a new life, still uncertain and full of challenges, was waiting for him. Outside, John walked towards the future, without looking back. He knew the road would be lonely, that the nights would be long and silent, but he also knew he needed this time, this distance. Maybe, in the future, he and Emily could meet again, in a different way, in a place where pain and regret were no longer the dominant forces. But for now, they needed to move on, each on their own journey, carrying with them the bitter lessons of love, betrayal and redemption that never came. And so, in the silence of the Boston night, two broken souls began to walk new paths, hoping that, one day, they would find the peace they sought.